So I think we'll start, and anyone who joins us later will just join in. So welcome to everyone who's here, and particularly welcome to Sean Hogan. So instead of asking you, instead of introducing you, I'm going to ask you to do that. So tell us a bit more about what you do and projects you've worked on and what you're going to be telling us more about today.
Okay, well, I'm a filmmaker and writer. So on the film side of things, I've sort of done a lot of work as a screenwriter for hire, but I've also worked on my own projects whenever I've been able to sort of put those together. For instance, I wrote and directed a film called The Devil's Business about 10 years ago. I produced a feature documentary, Future Shock, the story of 2000 AD, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And I co-wrote and kind of consulted on a film called The Borderlands. So those are probably the 3 projects I've done that are best known on the film side. I've worked on a bunch of other stuff, some of which will remain nameless. Yeah, let's say I've sort of done, I've worked as a jobbing screenwriter for about 10, 15 years as well. And then I've recently started writing as well and publishing books. So a few years ago, I did a smaller book on the film Deathline, which was sort of a critical monograph, but ended up being partly fictional. And I sort of followed that up this year with 2 new books, which I just have right here. One of which is England Screaming, which is a fictional study of UK horror cinema. And then a follow-up to that, which is called 3 Mothers, One Father, which does a similar thing for European horror cinema. Right. So, so I've been sort of doing more prose writing recently. I'm currently working on a novel, purely just a fictional novel, not film related. So yeah, I've kind of, have my feet in a couple of different camps currently.
Excellent. So we'll go through all of those things that you would be telling us about there. But first, I just want to talk to you a little bit more about the films you've done. So on some projects, you've taken on more than one role. For example, A Devil's Business, you said you wrote and you directed, you produced as well on that one. You've done many different things. So
edited. I do a lot of the editing on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit what it's like to do multiple different roles on the same project.
It can be stressful. On a film like that, it was an incredibly low budget film. It was done in reaction to the film that I'd been involved with previously, which was an anthology film called Little Deaths, which was an absolute nightmare from start to finish for numerous reasons. And once that was kind of wrapping up, it'd been such a horrific, draining experience that myself and my producer at the time just started talking about doing something small that we could control ourselves and just to make something for whatever money we could raise. And I'd had this idea for a small film. So we essentially just kind of scraped together whatever money we could. We both put some money in ourselves and had a couple of other investors. And that way we had no one really looking over our shoulders and we could control it from start to finish. But what that meant is that you inevitably end up having to wear more than one hat. So yes, I wrote it and directed it. I was an executive producer on it. I mean, the producer, Jen Handorf, was obviously the kind of day-to-day producer, certainly on set. I kind of oversaw certain things whilst we were in post and when we were looking at distribution and stuff like that. So I was involved in the production side of it, but I wasn't the only producer. But yeah, then, and I edited it I did the first edit on it, and then another editor came on just so there was someone I could bounce it back and forth with. So it's a very kind of like handcrafted way of making a film, and I wouldn't necessarily always choose to work that way. I think it's good to have other voices involved, but at the same time, you know, it was kind of necessary. That was the only way that film was going to get made. And I think it's often the case in indie films that you have to wear more than one hat, simply because there isn't the money or the resources to sort of bring in loads of people. So I think it's useful to kind of gain experience of those different roles. It can really help. But yeah, you know, it was at times very stressful to make because you don't have many other people to delegate to, so you're forever sort of taking on too many jobs at once. But yeah, at the same time, it was kind of a refreshing change after working on a bigger film where everyone was just trying to interfere constantly, you know, and yeah, I mean, without going into that whole mess, you know, it was a real breath of fresh air after the previous film. And it's, you know, I've done it since. We did a short film a few years back, which was I was commissioned to make a Christmas ghost story. And again, there wasn't really much of a budget, but it was kind of a passion project. It was something I really wanted to do. And I did that with the same team that I made Future Shock with, which is three guys that I've known for years. We were all at college together, and they have a production company, and they work in a very similar way, you know. So we've got quite a nice little team for doing these smaller projects. And yeah, I mean, you do end up multitasking, but that's just the way it goes.
Tell us a little bit more about what it's like to direct something and then have to simultaneously think about all the production decisions, and it's pulling you into different directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier when you're writing it as well, because then it's kind of a consistent sort of arc. Because if you're writing something with the knowledge that this is something A, I'm going to direct, and B, I'm going to direct on a very low budget, you're already making those decisions on the page. So you're not making things too hard for yourself, hopefully. I mean, there are always going to be problems. And God knows on that film, you know, we had some very significant problems, like right before we were going to shoot, we lost our location because the location owner decided that we were devil worshippers or something. They saw some promotional photos online and they basically just said, you're not filming here, and kept the money we'd paid them and all this sort of thing. So we had to scramble to find a replacement. And obviously on a low budget, you're like, this could just kill the film. So, you know, things like that you can't plan for. But beyond that, yeah, you know, you're trying to sort of factor in those kind of choices when you're writing the script, and then when you're shot listing or storyboarding or whatever else, so everything you're kind of thinking as a producer. You kind of have to as an indie filmmaker, even if you're not the de facto producer, you kind of have to have that hat on.
Okay. Yeah. So well, most of what you've done more recently, a lot of it has been writing, and you were telling us about the books, and you're currently writing a novel. And tell us a little bit about what you think makes a good writer, a successful writer.
Well, the two are not necessarily synonymous. I mean, as a good writer, I mean, obviously that's kind of subjective, but if you want to talk about, you know, sort of quality of writing, and you're as a screenwriter, I think you have to be good at certain things, primarily structure and understanding how you tell a story, how you construct a narrative, because screenplays are beyond anything. But you know, before you get into anything else, they are structure. So you have to be good at structure, And then after that, you get into things like writing dialogue and developing characters and all that kind of thing. And it's sort of like, yes, you do need to be good at those things to write a screenplay. Writing prose is something else entirely. But that doesn't necessarily make you a successful screenwriter. And I think in order to not even necessarily be successful, but to be a working screenwriter that someone actually want to employ, people tell horror stories about screenwriting. A lot of them are true. I've, worked on some nightmare jobs. Mm-hmm. Essentially, they want to hire you because they don't really know how to do what you do, but at the same time, everyone always thinks they know better than you. So you're kind of, it's a fairly thankless job, but what you do have to do, I'm not necessarily recommending it to anyone, but you certainly can't go into it thinking that I'm the artist and everyone else is an idiot and they're going to have to do what I tell them, because they're not going to. And whilst you can try and win them around to your way of thinking, essentially you're there to do a job. And if you can't do the job they want you to do, then you've really no business being a screenwriter. This is not to say that situations can't get unworkable, and I've certainly walked away from things because they've got to a point where I'm like, I can't really be involved with this anymore. But I think you have to treat it as though they're asking you to build something, and you just have to figure out the best way of building it. And your idea of the best way may not always be their idea of the best way, so you try and sort of find some workable solution to it. But it is very much problem solving. A lot of the time I find people will come to you and say, I've got this idea for a film and I want you to write it. They're not even asking you to generate the idea. And the idea may be good or it may not be very good. And the trick sometimes is to find an interesting way of coming at that idea. So you have to be sort of able to take material that other people are giving you and figuring out a way of telling it, mm-hmm. And possibly a way that might put a new spin on it or hasn't been done before. But it's very much about interpreting what other people want to do.
Yeah, so often the outcome might be something that is set in a certain way, or do you get given guidelines? Producers give you guidelines?
Yeah, sometimes, I've worked as a script doctor, so sometimes you get given an existing script and asked to rework it, sometimes quite significantly. Other times, they may just have a very basic kind of pitch, and it may just be a few sentences or a paragraph or whatever, just a kind of nugget of what they want to do, and you have to try and figure out a way of doing it. I worked on a film like that a few years ago, and the core idea was kind of generic. Mm-hmm. So what I tried to do was think of a way in which to approach it, which was different, which hadn't been done before. And I didn't get a lot of guidance on the first draft. They kind of let me do what I wanted to do. So, and it was a horror movie, it was a genre movie, but I thought it would be interesting to approach it as, it was very much kind of about a couple and their first child. And it was meant to be some kind of metaphor for, having your first child and not coping, but with a sort of generic spin on it. I thought it would be interesting to approach it as kind of a relationship comedy and have it gradually turn into a horror film. So I wrote this kind of like neurotic relationship comedy that gradually got darker and darker and darker, thinking that would be a really interesting way to do it. And I handed it in, and I remember like going for the first meeting, after the first draft, and I sat there and they all said, yeah, it's really funny, take all the jokes out.
Wow. Okay.
Because that's kind of what being a screenwriter is like. They just wanted it to be more generic, and I was like trying to find, I thought, an interesting way of doing it, but that's not always the way it goes.
So you said, so England's Screaming, which is that book, very beautiful cover that you had there.
Yep.
So if anyone missed it, it's England's Screaming.
Yes. Yeah.
There it is. Very nice book indeed. So it's a fictional book, but it's based on the true films in the
Yes, it's based on
history in the
English
UK.
horror films. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about that and how it is to combine fact and fiction. How do they mix together?
Well, okay. So just to give you a quick bit of background on it, it's kind of a riff on an existing book, a book written in the 1980s called Suspects, which takes a collection of characters from film noir movies and sort of interweaves the stories and takes the stories beyond the films. And it was a book I'd always loved. And I kind of eventually had the idea of doing a horror version of it, doing the same thing with horror films. And I kind of had this idea quite a few years ago, but never thought I'd actually write it because I wasn't at the time writing prose fiction at all. I was just a screenwriter. And then eventually various things led me down the path of starting to do a bit of dabbling in prose. And I suddenly, like I said, I wrote this other book on the film Deathline, which I kind of ended up doing some of that in that book. The part of that book was fictional. And I'd sort of mentioned to the editor of that book that it had come from this idea I'd had to write this version of Suspects about horror cinema. And he basically said, if you ever write that book, I'll publish it. So I kind of had a guaranteed publisher. And then a couple of years later, I kind of ended up with the time to do it. So I sat down and started writing it. So what it does is it takes a number of characters from various English horror films, going from the earliest one in there is Dead of Night, and it goes all the way up to Possum, which I think came out about a year or so ago. So it kind of runs the gamut of English horror cinema, and it basically takes different characters from different films and sort of takes their stories beyond the films and interweaves them and kind of creates this whole big tapestry of English horror cinema, but at the same time kind of uses it as a lens to look at England as a country. So it's kind of a satirical novel. It's very sort of political, and it's very much about sort of class and all sorts of other things as well. And it's kind of, looking at these films as sociological documents whilst also being, hopefully kind of scary and funny and all sorts of other things.
Interesting. So that sounds very different from what it sounds like you were saying about writing a screenplay. It's a completely different way to look at it. Tell us a little bit more about the differences for you, and it's a different process. I mean, everything's different. So talk a bit more about that, I guess. Hopefully that's
I mean, I kind of I sort of threw out everything I knew about writing out the window, really, because it's as you say, it's a completely different process. As a screenwriter, I plan a lot. It's maybe less so now than I used to, but having been doing it for a while. But you're always thinking about the structure first, because it's like, what's the best way to tell this story? What are the building blocks I need to tell this story? Whereas when you're writing like a novel or a kind of quasi novel, which this is, I started off by trying to think about it on a structural level, but I quickly decided that I could spend years just doing that, because I didn't really. There are about, I can't remember how many characters there are in the book. There are about 35 chapters, I think, which are all individual characters, but then there are a number of other characters in the background that don't necessarily have their own chapters, but sort of pop in and out of the story. So I don't know quite how many characters are involved in the book, and I thought about sort of drawing a roadmap of how they would all intertwine with each other, and I just thought I could drive myself insane doing that. I might just spend years working on that. So I just kind of plunged into it. I knew roughly what the overall story was, and I knew where it would end, but I didn't really know how I was going to get there or where it would go along the way, because I was literally I would get up in the mornings and I would watch. I had like a list of films to watch or rewatch, and I would watch them and sort of decide whether or not they were going to be included. I would watch film in the morning, and then I would sit down and work on a chapter in the afternoon. And so I was as I was writing it, I was still deciding what films were going to go in there, which was how, Possum, like, it was the most recent film in there, and I watched that whilst I was working on the book, and I thought, oh, I've got to include it, and it ended up kind of slotting in very nicely in with a couple of other films. But yeah, it was completely just sort of like figuring it out as I went along, and I would not normally approach a screenplay in that way, because it's a much more focused way of writing, whereas this, I just had the freedom to kind of improvise. And obviously once I'd done the first draft, I did kind of go back and make changes and make sure everything fit properly. But yeah, it was kind of very liberating in a way to do that.
Yeah. So potentially more freedom with writing something other than a screenplay.
I think, yeah, I mean, screenplays are a very disciplined form, because, they generally have to be a certain length within a certain length. There are certain things that screenplays are good at doing. There are other things that they're not very good at doing, but it's quite rigorous. And especially if you're writing something that has to be done for a certain budget. So you're always there's always a voice in the back of your mind sort of saying, how much is that going to cost? Are you going to be able to do that? Can you afford this? Whatever else, is this too many locations, etc., etc., etc. Like, even if you're writing for hire, you still have to consider those things, because there's no point in having in a screenplay that's going to cost millions if they've only got hundreds of thousands. So you're always thinking like that. Whereas in a book, you can write anything you damn well please, and you can go anywhere and do anything. So it is very freeing. It's kind of nice to do that. At the same time, I kind of like the discipline of writing screenplays. It's, I've been doing it for so long that my brain sort of thinks that way. So, it's still fun to do that. It's still nice to sometimes kind of have rules.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's also nice to have another outlet now, and also an outlet that I'm in control of, because essentially no one's really telling me what to do, and as long as I can get it published, then that's really my only problem. I don't have to please lots of other people beyond, an editor and a publisher.
So the novel you're writing at the moment,
yes,
that's based on a screenplay you wrote previously.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about the process of doing that, because we all know a lot of it works a lot the other way around, where source material gets adapted for film. But what is it like writing a novel based on a previous screenplay that you've written?
Yeah, well, this is a screenplay that I originally wrote probably maybe the best part of 10 years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I tried to set it up a couple of times, and people seemed to like it, but it never quite got off the ground. But I always liked the story, and I always wanted to do something with it. So when I started thinking about actually writing a proper novel, I suddenly thought, that screenplay would work as a novel. I know how to do it as a novel. And in a way, it's actually been a really good process of me sort of sitting down to write, a coherent novel, rather than the kind of patchwork that England Screaming is, because it meant that I already had a narrative line to follow. I didn't get lost along the way. But at the same time, because the screenplay was kind of the spine of it, but obviously a novel, you have much more room to do stuff. So I was able to flesh out a lot of things along the way and add in different kind of facets to it. But the actual story is still basically the same. I've just kind of put a lot more meat on its bones. So it actually made writing a novel much easier in a way for me. So someone who's obviously kind of relatively new to it, it was, you know, as a process, it was, you know, I'd actually kind of recommend it. Another writer I know who's actually, you know, quite a successful writer has recently started writing screenplays as well. And he said to me that he recently ended up doing the same thing. He'd written this screenplay and then he decided to turn it into a novel. And I was like, well, I'm actually doing exactly the same thing. But he's obviously much more experienced as a novelist than I am the other way around. But yeah, it's actually kind of a useful way of doing it.
Yeah, but it works very often the other way around as well. Have you got any experience of that, or why do you think that's so successful?
The one experience I have doing something like that was a project which hasn't yet been made. I still kind of hope it would. It kind of, I think it was one of those things that there was a lot of interest in it and it came close. A friend of mine who's a sort of film writer and programmer and all sorts of things, Kayla Janice, wrote a book called House of Psychotic Women, which is partly a study of films and is partly an autobiography. And she kind of intermingles the two and uses the films to talk about certain parts of her life and all this kind of thing. And it's a very interesting book, and did very well, but not the kind of thing you'd ever think, oh, well, that's crying out to be made into a film or something like that. But nevertheless, a producer did approach her about doing something with it. And she came to me and said, look, this producer wants to turn this into a film or a TV show or something. Would you be interested in getting involved? And I was like, well, yeah, but I don't really understand what you're proposing. And so anyway, we kind of all spoke about it and eventually figured out a way to do it. And so what I ended up doing was writing a pilot for a TV show, which sort of fictionalized the events in her life, put them in sort of a fictional framework, and then kind of used the films as background material and kind of wove in references to the films in various ways. And I had a really good time doing it, and everyone really liked the script. But it was just one of those things that kind of ended up in development hell. So, but it may or may still be active. I'm not entirely sure. But I really, really enjoyed doing it. It was one of the things I've done as a writer for hire that I most enjoyed, and I was happy with, and everyone was happy with the script. And it was just kind of one of those moments where you're all in sync. Everyone likes what you're doing, and it's a shame it hasn't yet been made. But yeah, I mean, that was definitely, obviously that wasn't quite a literal adaptation, but it as a lesson in kind of, sometimes you get given a piece of material and you need to figure out the best way of doing it. It was quite useful and an interesting experience. I mean, beyond that, you know, I mean, obviously stuff gets turned into films because a lot of the time it was a successful book and people just think, therefore, if we make it as a film, it will be a successful film, which is not always the case. Some novels are easily turned into films, some are not good material for films. I mean, people are always looking for material, you know, and sometimes it's just about IP. Sometimes something's just a really good story and, you know, is crying out to be made into a film. So there are all sorts of reasons things get made. And, you know, a novel, you might be able to make a novel into a film in 10 different ways, and only one or two of them might be any good, but that's the kind of nature of the beast.
Yeah. So aside from what you've been telling us about, where do you get inspiration from as a writer? Where do you start? What sets you off?
Oh, it can be anything. I mean, sometimes ideas just kind of bubble up out of your subconscious. You know, you literally can be sitting on the bus or something, and it will just pop into your head. I've had a couple of those, and sometimes they're kind of the best in a way, because it's almost like they're just crying to be made, crying to be written. But it's not always like that. I mean, sometimes, you know, I'm a voracious watcher of films, reader. You know, I listen to a lot of music. I love just kind of creative stuff in general, and a lot of times you just get ideas from other art.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of stuff I've done has kind of been a reaction to or a riff on other pieces of art.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously England Screaming is about horror films. The Devil's Business was actually kind of a riff on a Harold Pinter play. I suddenly had the idea that you could do a horror version of this play, The Dumbwaiter. And it doesn't really bear much resemblance to the play beyond the kind of basic setup. But it just suddenly, we were talking about doing a low budget film, and we were in a pub, and I had a couple of drinks, and I just suddenly thought, you could do a version of The Dumbwaiter as a horror film. It would really work as a horror film. That was how it started. Like I said, the last thing I directed, the short film I did a couple of years ago, was a commission to do a riff on the old ghost stories for Christmas that the BBC used to do in the 70s, the M.R. James adaptations. And the executive producer of that very much wanted to do something in that vein, and I love those films as well. So I was, you know, very happy to do something in that vein. So sometimes you're responding to another piece of art, and sometimes it's just an original idea. And then, yeah, certainly as a working writer, sometimes people come to you with an idea, and you're just trying to take their idea and bounce it off the wall and see which way it comes back, you know. So yeah, it's inspiration is not really the problem. There are all sorts of ways to get inspiration, but inspiration will only get you so far. You have to figure out how to actually do the damn thing.
So I have one final question.
Okay.
What advice would you give people who are thinking about writing a screenplay or getting into writing in general or filmmaking? What are your top tips for working in film?
Oh God, there are so many different facets to that question. I mean, purely as a writer, you know, I would say you need to really sort of look at how films are constructed. You know, read scripts, watch films, understand how scripts work. What you will find is that a lot of people who make films, and I'm talking about producers and people like that, don't necessarily understand how to read a script. So you had better understand how a script works, because they are not necessarily going to. People have a lot of trouble visualizing how a script on a page what it's going to be on screen, and how scripts work, and how things that are kind of implicit in a script an audience will be able to understand once it's on a screen. You know, there's a real art to sort of writing subtext and being able to suggest story through not only just dialogue, but also the kind of images that you're suggesting in a script.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have to understand how to kind of put that on a page. because, like I say, you're sometimes dealing with people who don't understand it themselves, so you'd better understand it. I mean, as a filmmaker, you know, there's probably not enough time to go into all the things I would say. It is a tricky business. It is frequently treacherous. A lot of the stories you hear are true. There are some very unscrupulous, dishonest people out there. I kind of learned it by doing. I wish I'd known now, or known then what I know now in some cases. So, you know, if you're going to make independent films and you're going to end up sort of doing, you know, the sort of projects where you do end up wearing a lot of hats, you need to sort of have an understanding of the playing field, and you need to understand things like contracts and distribution and all this stuff, because otherwise you're going to get your fingers burnt. So, you know, I would say if you're looking to do something like that, it's a good idea to speak to people who've already done it, because if they've got horror stories and cautionary tales to tell you, you know, more often than not, they'll gladly give you some good advice, stuff that I could have done with knowing a long time ago, you know. So yeah, and just, but yeah, keep doing it, you know, I think I remember once reading something that, you know, you need to write at least 6 screenplays before you'll write a good one, and I think that's about true. That's about right. I think that's pretty much what I did before I ever wrote anything that got made. So you just keep doing it. And, you know, I read a lot of scripts people give to me for comments, and there's a lot of like bad stuff out there. People don't necessarily, and some of it's being made, you know, but there's a lot of people who still don't understand how to write a script properly. So, you know, you can do it. The world is always crying out for good writers. Just keep plugging away at it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I'm going to open it out to audience questions.
Okay.
We've got a few so far. If anyone has any questions, like I said at the beginning, what we'll do is if you can put them in the chat box and I will ask them for you, it will just save a lot of internet issues if we do it that way. So yeah, if you have a question, please put it into the box and we'll start with the ones we have so far. So first couple of questions are from David. He wants to know a bit more about the documentary you made called Future Shock.
Yeah.
And he wants to know a bit more about how that got shaped, because it was a documentary. So you've got existing people and it's based on reality, and it's not something that you've fictionally come up with and written yourself. So how did that come about, and did it take you in a different direction from what was intended at the beginning?
Right. Well, so that was on the sort of structure of writing sort of side. That was kind of an interesting experience, because I was the sort of main producer on it, but I also kind of ended up functioning as a sort of writer, because we spent probably several years kind of filming interviews for it, and obviously there was a certain slant to the questions in terms of like roughly the sort of story we thought we might be telling. But you don't know what you're going to get. Some people are going to give you good stuff, other people not so much. You can't always tell what the material is going to be. So when we started to put it all together, the first cut I sat and looked at, which was basically kind of all the good stuff. It wasn't really shaped in any way. It was just sort of like, this is the stuff that might be worth including. Was about 9 or 10 hours long. And yeah, my job then was to kind of go, right, this is the story. So I kind of sat there with the director and basically sort of said, all right, we've got all this stuff, but here's our story. This is how we're going to tell this story. And so then it's just a case of throwing out everything that wasn't the story. And you know, there was all sorts of good stuff that didn't get included, which, you know, what did finally end up on the Blu-ray, which was nice because there was all sorts of good material. But it was still about figuring out the story and what the best way to tell it was. So it was kind of an ass backwards way of doing it, but still kind of ended up being, again, you know, it's just a similar thing as being a screenwriter and it being about structure. I mean, was David asking about how the film came about as well, just in the original sense of the word?
He said how much of your structure was dictated and shaped by your subjects, their stories, and what you learned from them, and did the unscripted inputs take you in the film in different directions than you expected or intended? So no, but okay. It would be good to know, I think.
Well, that was really a case of the director, who as I said, someone I've known for a long time, basically said to me one evening in the pub, you know what I've always wanted to do? I've always wanted to do a documentary on 2000 AD. And it was just one of those times when someone gives you a good idea and you go, yes, I will help you do that.
Yeah.
And so basically we just did it. I mean, as I say, they have a production company. Him and his two partners in crime have a production company. They mainly sort of do corporate stuff. Mm-hmm. We were all at college together, and I kind of went the indie filmmaker route, and they went in sort of doing more corporate stuff. But I think they were getting frustrated with simply doing that kind of thing. And so they were quite eager to do something a bit more creative. And I just, you know, I grew up reading 2000 AD, as did they. I just thought it was a story that hadn't been covered properly. And so we just kind of leapt into it. And again, it was completely in-house. We didn't have any other producers or, you know, backers or anything like that. So we were fully in control of it, and we just kind of did it off our own backs. And it took a while to do, because we were just kind of doing it as and when we could. But luckily, you know, everyone was really cooperative. We went to the 2000 AD publisher and said, we want to do this, will you cooperate? And they were like, yep, we'll give you whatever you want to do, whatever you need from us. And they started introducing us to people, and everyone was just kind of like, yeah, this is long overdue, so we're happy to take part. You know, there were a couple of people that wouldn't be interviewed, but we got a lot of people. So it was kind of a real joy to do. It was, again, a real labor of love, and was a lot of work. And I don't know that I'd necessarily want to do another documentary ever, but I'm glad we did that one.
So we have another question from Ian Cruikshank.
Hello, Ian.
He wants to know, can you tell everyone a bit more about Borderlands? And it changed from the original story?
Yeah, so Borderlands was an interesting experience. It was not something I was originally involved with. But it was made by the same company that had released The Devil's Business in the UK, and it was their first in-house production. And the producer I'd worked with on The Devil's Business was producing it, but it was not anything I was originally involved with. And they had this script, and they went and shot the first version of the script and put a cut together, and the production company were unhappy with it. They thought it was a disaster, and they came to me and said, will you look at this film we've got and give us your thoughts on it? So I watched the cut, and I didn't think it was a disaster because I thought the two central actors were really good. But I could see that there were problems with it. It needed punching up in certain ways. It wasn't, I thought it needed, you know, more scary stuff, more character stuff, this kind of thing. And the executive producer said, basically, if you could write anything to make this film better, what would you write? And essentially, I then got commissioned to write stuff that would sort of fit in with the material they had, but would work to punch up the film in various ways. So I had to kind of figure out what scenes could be shot that would fit in with what they had. You know, obviously there was room to restructure certain things, but it had to work with the bulk of the material they had. So I went away and wrote a bunch of stuff, and then essentially they went away and shot it. And what happened was that they hired a new editor, and the producer kind of did a new cut with the new editor. And I consulted on the cut and all this kind of thing. And basically sort of a group of us got together and kind of rethought this film from the ground up. And it was funny because I think the production company had kind of always written it off in their minds after that first cut, which they weren't happy with, because they were not experienced in like how you make a film. They'd already written it off. So by the time we finished it, I think they were just kind of going to chuck it out and forget about it and just consider it a write-off. And, you know, by the end, I thought we'd actually put something together that was pretty decent, and we'd actually improved it a lot. And then it screened, premiered at Fright Fest, and everyone went nuts for it. And all of a sudden it became this film that it was getting really, really good reviews for like a relatively low budget genre film. Getting good mainstream reviews, and you know, it was kind of a lesson in how you can turn a film around in post-production, and how, you know, sometimes people don't necessarily understand what they've got. I've worked in situations a lot where people look at rushes or whatever and don't really understand what's good and how it's all going to fit together, and it was a real kind of lesson in that. So yeah, it was an interesting experience, but I was never officially credited on it. I've got a very special thank you at the end, so I've seen credit for stuff I've written go to other people over the years. But yeah, no, I did actually quite a fair bit of work on that.
Does anyone else have any questions? If you have any questions, put it in the chat box. In the meantime, what was the name of your second book there, Sean? You showed us the second one.
3 Mothers, One Father.
3 Mothers, One Father. Okay, so if anyone is interested in those books, it's Three Mothers, One Father, and England Screaming was the other one. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second book is about European horror cinema. It's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah. Cool. And we'll wait to see about the next one, the novel.
Yeah, well, I'm still working on that. I'm sort of getting towards the end of the current draft, so hopefully I'll get it finished relatively soon, and then we'll see if anyone will actually publish it.
Cool. So if there are no more questions, then we'll finish there. Thank you so much, Sean. And
it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
It was well, I thought it was very interesting. So thank you from me, and Ian says thank you as well, and I hope it was interesting for everyone else too. So I'm recording the session. So if anyone wants to email me to have a copy of it, or if anyone missed some of it, let me know. I have it available, and I'll send it to you, Sean, as well, if anyone wants it off on your end. And yeah, other than that, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. Thanks very much.
Take care. Bye, everyone.